Mason and Riley continued to move, each footstep a careful whisper against the silence of the abandoned streets. The sun, barely cresting over the ruined skyline, cast long shadows that seemed to reach out, turning every corner and doorway into a potential ambush site. Despite the emptiness around them, both were acutely aware of the dangers lurking in the unseen places. Hours had passed since they heard the faint scream echo across the broken streets. It was a chilling reminder that, even though the dead were their most persistent enemies, they weren't alone in the city. Somewhere, hidden among the crumbling remnants of civilization, survivors eked out a tenuous existence. And not all of them would be friendly. As they moved, Mason and Riley made a point to stick to narrow alleys and back streets, staying out of open spaces where their movements would be easily noticed. Mason's eyes flicked over every shadow, and he constantly checked his surroundings, his jaw tense with worry. Riley kept close, matching his every step, her nerves worn thin by the silence and the weight of their uncertainty. It was Riley who spotted him first. Just ahead, a figure crouched behind an overturned dumpster, his back turned, unaware of their approach. He was armed. Mason could see the glint of a knife in one hand and a handgun strapped to his belt. He looked worse for wear, his clothes filthy and torn, a mix of grime and dried blood smeared across his exposed skin. Mason motioned for Riley to stop, and they crouched behind a crumbling wall, watching him silently. It was impossible to know if he was friendly or just another threat. "What do we do?" Riley whispered, her voice barely audible. Mason considered. "We don't have a lot of options. We can try to pass by without him noticing, or," he paused, catching Riley's eye. "Or we make contact." Riley bit her lip, glancing between Mason and the stranger. She didn't want another fight, they'd had enough close calls. But at the same time, another pair of eyes could be useful. Or dangerous. They didn't know which yet. Mason gave her a reassuring look. "Stay here. If things go south, you know what to do." She nodded, gripping her small blade tightly. Mason approached the stranger slowly, his hands raised in a show of peace. "Hey," Mason called out softly. The man tensed, his hand moving to the gun at his side, but he didn't draw it. He turned, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on Mason. "Who the hell are you?" he growled, his voice hoarse and sharp. "Just a traveler," Mason replied, keeping his tone calm. "We don't mean any harm. Just passing through." The stranger seemed to relax a little, though his hand didn't stray far from his weapon. "Passing through? There's nothing left in this city but the dead." "Maybe. But we're trying to get south. Heard there are communities down in Florida, places still holding out." The man scoffed. "Florida? That's one hell of a trip, friend. And trust me, there's more than just the dead between here and there." Mason nodded slowly. "Figured as much." A tense silence stretched between them, and then, unexpectedly, the stranger sighed, lowering his guard slightly. "Name's Carter," he said finally, giving Mason a weary nod. "If you're going south, I might be able to help. But it's not for free." Mason glanced back at Riley, who was watching intently from her hiding spot. He turned back to Carter, his face cautious. "What do you have in mind?" "I know the routes out of this city. Safe places to rest, areas where you can find supplies. But I need something in return." Mason frowned, unsure what they could offer a man like Carter. They barely had enough supplies for themselves, let alone anything extra to trade. "Look, Carter," Mason began, "we're barely scraping by ourselves. We don't have much to offer. Carter shook his head. I don't need supplies. I need backup. There's something I need to get out of the city, something I've been trying to recover for weeks. But I can't do it alone. Mason weighed the request carefully. The thought of helping a stranger in the middle of an infested city was dangerous, but if Carter truly knew safe routes and supply caches, his help would be invaluable. What is it? Mason asked, his tone cautious. Carter hesitated, his eyes darkening with an old pain. My brother. He didn't make it. But he had something I need, a map. He was a survivalist, kept records of safe zones, locations of outposts. I know he kept it on him, but I can't get to him alone. The weight of his words settled over them. Mason exchanged a look with Riley, whose face was a mixture of fear and determination. We'll help you, Mason finally said. But you have to promise us a safe route out of the city. Carter nodded solemnly. You have my word. But we have to move fast. The building where he is, it's not far. But it's infested. We'll need to keep quiet and stick together. They moved through the streets with Carter leading the way, taking routes Mason would never have known to exist. Hidden paths, alleys covered by debris, old fire escapes, they made their way quickly, keeping low and silent. The sun was higher now, casting the city in a pale, ghostly light, illuminating the devastation with an almost surreal clarity. As they approached their destination, a narrow, crumbling apartment complex, Carter signaled for them to stop. He's on the second floor, he whispered, nodding to the darkened windows. I don't know how many of them are inside, but we need to be quiet. Quick and quiet. Riley swallowed nervously, her eyes darting between Mason and Carter. Mason could see the fear in her, but he knew she wouldn't back down. She'd come too far. The three of them crept into the building, their footsteps muffled by the dirt and debris that carpeted the floor. The air was stale, thick with the smell of decay, and the silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. As they reached the second floor, Carter pointed to a door at the end of the hall. That's his room. Mason moved forward, testing the handle. It was unlocked. With a nod to Riley and Carter, he pushed the door open slowly, peering into the darkened room. The smell hit them first, a foul stench that made Riley gag. Inside, the body of Carter's brother lay slumped against the wall, his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Carter moved to his brother's side, his expression a mixture of grief and determination. He searched the body quickly, his hands moving over the tattered clothing until he found what he was looking for, a small, worn leather journal. He clutched it tightly, his jaw set. This is it. This is everything we need. But as they turned to leave, a low, guttural moan echoed from down the hall. Mason froze, glancing back toward the doorway. Shadows moved in the dim light, and the unmistakable shuffle of the dead grew louder. Run, Carter whispered, his voice tight with fear. They bolted down the hall, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they made their way toward the stairwell. The dead were close behind, their raspy breaths and clawing hands just steps away. The three of them burst out of the building and into the open air, sunlight blinding them momentarily as they sprinted down the street. Mason could hear the horde behind them, the echoing growls growing louder as more of the dead were drawn to the commotion. Over here! Carter shouted, leading them down a narrow alleyway. They ducked behind an old, rusted gate, crouching low as the horde thundered past, oblivious to their hiding spot. For a long, tense moment, they remained still, listening as the sounds of the dead gradually faded into the distance. Finally, Carter let out a shaky breath, clutching the journal to his chest. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know how much this means to me." Mason nodded, glancing at Riley, who looked equally relieved and exhausted. "A deal's a deal. Now show us the way out of here." With a final nod, Carter led them down the alley, away from the remnants of his past and into the uncertain future that lay ahead.